Cans it up, the Penguins will change it. If they're able to come out relatively easy, here's Keith Primo with it first. Primo cuts the inside, scores! There it is! Keith Primo! The much maligned center of the Philadelphia Flyers wins this game in the fifth overtime.
Everybody, it's Isaiah as PhillySportsNetwork.com and Wildfire Radio present the O&B Puckcast, episode number 53, as we look at the state of the Flyers. I'm here with my partners, Chef B. How are you, man?
Good.
Okay. And also from Brotherly Puck, Brotherly Pod, National Puck, National Pod, Dan the Flyer fan. How are you, man?
I am doing pretty good, Isaiah. How are you?
Okay. And also from the fourthperiod.com, we have a no-show, gents. Yes, we do. Now, Anthony DeMarco is on vacation. I hope he's enjoying himself, as the Canadians like to go to cottages. Like, you know, I guess that's their version of down the shore, whatever is available in Canada. So, and there's nothing wrong with that. So he's somewhere in Ontario, supposedly. He's not being chased by the law, but actually, I can't confirm that last bit. He may indeed be a fugitive from justice. So, Anthony DeMarco, if you want to send us a message and make sure that you're not in any trouble, just let us know. But yeah, we got a lot to talk about tonight. Since the last time we spoke to you, in about 25 minutes or so, we're going to have Anthony Mingioni from Center's Philly Magazine and the Off the Post podcast. We're going to go pretty comprehensive with him about top to bottom, the organization on and off the ice, a little couple items also about the Phantoms and the prospects. So we're real excited. So let's get down to it. Dan, it is official. The speculation that Nikita Gusev would be traded. It's gone down. The Vegas Golden Knights have traded the forward to the New Jersey Devils. The Metro just got better. In return, the Vegas Golden Knights get a 2020 third-round pick and a 2021 second-round pick. In 62 games in the KHL for St. Petersburg Ska, he had 17 goals, and 82 points. A 5'11", 176, average skater, but very crafty, and apparently has very good vision. What more can you tell us?
Well, I don't think anybody's super surprised that he ended up in the Metro, because of course he did. He's a good player, so that's where they all come these days. And I mean, you got to really give it up to the Devils. They've had a phenomenal offseason thus far, and they found a way to, continue to improve and found another player that they're taking a risk on. They're relatively cheap, 2 years at 4.5 per. So yeah. It's a good deal for them. It's a good player, helps their depth at forward, and gives them yet another offensive weapon if he can convert well at the NHL level.
Well, that's the big if. I mean, some of these guys translate like Panarin, and then you have others that are kind of more like duds. Who was that defenseman we had that looked good, but didn't quite make it for the Flyers a couple years ago? I forget.
Evgeny Medvedev.
Yes, Medvedev. Yeah. So.
Yeah, had a cool name though.
Yeah, I liked it.
It looked good on a jersey.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have one of them?
I do not have an Evgeny Medvedev jersey. Yeah.
No.
Yes.
But. Yes, and then you look at the Devils. Chef, they now have added Wayne Simmons along with Gusev, Jack Hughes. Of course, they drafted first overall, and you have Nico Hischier was already there, and he's just at that point where he should be hitting his stride. Of course, they added PK Subban, and they still have a little bit of a shortage on D and maybe a hope and a prayer in net. They just got better today, and I think they're more of a playoff contender now after this acquisition.
Yeah, I could say that. I'm one of the naysayers in this scenario. I don't know if Simmons comes back and has a great season. To me, they have a lot of ifs. If this comes together, the goaltending's a question, the D's a question, and like you said, I just think they're not as scary as people are making them out to be. Of course, for the Flyers, the Devils are always scary, no matter who. It could be the worst team in the league, and we'll lose the season series with them. But that's just the way it goes with the Devils.
That's a given. But now that they have more talent on top of that, it makes it more likely that they're going to lose some of those games. I swear, the Flyers play the Devils, and there's a certain point where it's, what is it, like 2-0 or 3-1, and the Devils always come back, and then you have that sickening feeling like, we're going to lose again to the Devils, aren't we? You know, it could be a Saturday afternoon game or what have you. You know, it's just.
It's always one of those Saturday afternoon games too. It's like a kick in the butt for you.
Yeah, maybe somewhere else, but yeah. And then the Tampa Bay Lightning signed Andrei Vasilevsky for 8 years at $9.5 million, and I'm thinking, well, let me see. Kucherov makes $9.5 million, so they're probably not going to give him more than Kucherov, and he probably made concessions relative to Bobrovsky's $10 million contract due to the the state tax and the fact that, of course, Tampa is a proven Stanley Cup at least a contender.
Yeah, I was more or less expecting, in the $9 to $10 million range. He's 25 years old, and he's locked up till 2028 now. Tampa obviously still has Braden Point unsigned. They have a little over $5.5 million left cap space. But, it's amazing that they have been able to maneuver the cap this well and lock in their, number one goalie in Vasilevsky at a reasonable market value at this day and age is a pretty good move by them.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they have about $5.6 million left in cap space, and they still have to pay Braden Point. And what's he going to get in the neighborhood of 8-9?
More than likely is my guess.
8.5, I'm thinking, in that neighborhood.
8.5.
Okay, we'll go with that. That sounds very familiar. Is that Jake's contract?
Yes.
Yeah.
2.75.
I bet he's a better player for them. But yeah, so you think at some point they're going to have to let go of somebody like Tyler Johnson or Alex Killorn. Alex Killorn making 4.45. So, but we'll have to. They're going to work it out. All these teams that right now are close after they pay their RFAs, or right now are over, like the Rangers, the Leafs, the Capitals, and the Penguins. They're going to be making moves, and it begs the question, Chef. I was listening to the Snow the Goalie and Off Stick to Hockey podcast. That's what it was. It was a combo show, and our buddy Russ Cohen was on with Anthony Sanfilippo, Russ Joy, and of course Jason Martinez. And I think it was Anthony who said that Ghost is still a trade candidate. AV apparently wanted to fix him, quote unquote, but after having an opportunity to watch his video, he may be less enthusiastic. And I'm thinking, well, I think that's really an outside chance at this point. But when you look at these teams that have to make moves to get under the cap, maybe a player could be available that they like, where they would feel okay in shipping out somebody like Ghost if they could get another player who sacrificed for salary purposes. Any of that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned something of a little bit of a scenario like that happening earlier before the trade deadline. It wouldn't surprise me. I think especially now, like you said, there are teams that are over, and a tweaking here and a tweaking there and eating a little bit of cap space and all. So I definitely think it is not out of the realm of possibility. What found me more surprising, though, was that he said he didn't want to fix it anymore. So that makes me even more nervous about going into this season if he's still behind the blue line there.
Well, I mean, look, if it was coming from anybody practically other than Anthony, I would think, it would be dubious. But just to clarify, what I'm saying is the Flyers identified players that could be available from some of these teams that have to clear cap space, and they weigh their options. They already have some potential deals for Ghost kind of in the hopper, and they could just pull the dipsy-do flipperoo, and Ghost is traded, and then they pick up one of the other guys, kind of maybe a little bit at a discount, and go from there. I don't think it's real likely because the Flyers could still use some of the offense that Ghost provides. Mm-hmm. So, but it is not. The word is on the inside that AV is less enthusiastic now that he's had an opportunity to watch Ghost play in his own zone, which is apparently he was not that impressed. So, we'll have to see how that works. But the Flyers do have some other areas of concern. And Dan, you wrote an article at brotherlypuck.com about the health of Brian Elliott, and are concerns about it valid? Why don't you sum up what you found and maybe some of the conclusions that you came to in that article?
Yeah, this is one of the more disappointing moves I think that the Flyers made this summer. I think finding a backup goaltender that could carry some weight was crucial, and I don't think they necessarily addressed that. I don't necessarily want to take it out on Brian Elliott because it's not his fault. He did play well down the stretch this past season. When Carter Hart went down around the Stadium Series, and he gave him a fighting chance. But, he's 34. He's had 2 surgeries and, 3 major injuries in the past season and a half. I've heard people say, well, it was Dave Haxtell that ran him to the ground. Whatever the case is, the injuries happened. And at his age, bouncing back and being able to take a big chunk of time if something happens to Carter Hart, I don't think that's necessarily a good move. I mean, didn't we, we went through this same story last summer with Elliott and Neuwirth. Now, granted, Hart is better and more likely healthier than, either one of Elliott or Neuwirth. But if something were to happen and, injuries are freak accidents, all of a sudden you're looking at, a very similar scenario with Lyon or JF Berube coming up to back him up. And I really don't trust either one of those two making, long starts. So I don't know. I wish they would have found somebody a little better, a little more trustworthy. Obviously, with the cap crunch that they have after Hayes, Niskanen, and Braun, they kind of were forced their hand a little bit. But I was just disappointed that they didn't really address the backup goaltender the right way.
Yeah, that was one of my pet peeves this offseason when they go out and get Braun because they want another guy along with Niskanen, and they want the right-handed shot, and they went and took up, what was it, 3.85 in cap space, and to me that just shut them out of any opportunity to make a trade for somebody, whatever, have the money to pay more, just to ensure that Carter Hart didn't have that all falling on him. And I'm just going by what Fletcher said himself. He wanted a goaltender to play with Carter Hart who could handle anywhere from 30 to 50 games. I think everyone on this panel would agree. If Brian Elliott ends up playing 50 games, either because of regression, which has happened to 20-year-old goaltenders after a good season, or because of injury, the Flyers are SOL.
Yeah, I kind of have to agree with that. I mean, I saw, if realistically speaking, if you're thinking of it's Elliott, I think 25 games, 30 is a ceiling for him, and that's it. I think after that, you run the risk of getting maybe one start in every 7 games here and there. But I'm disappointed too. I think everybody in the fan base is a little disappointed, and also too the market was very lean this year in the terms of goalies to get on the free agency. So
you know what I think is going to happen, Chef. I think what's going to the way it's going to go down is some of these goalies are going to get let go with the RFAs getting signed and some of the last minute roster shuffling, and maybe Fletcher felt like he couldn't wait that long. But I have a feeling some good names that competent. I'm not saying the guys are going to be great, but better alternatives will have been available in hindsight. Of course, hindsight's always 20/20, but I would have let the market play out a little bit more. I mean, if you're missing out on a 34-year-old Brian Elliott, given what's going down, like Dan said, I can live with that. I just want it better. And their split is supposed to be 50-30. That's what they're looking for. If Hart can cut it for 50 games, then the Flyers could probably be okay. So we got to cross our fingers again with the goaltending. I don't think we'll get to 8 goaltenders next year, but maybe 7. Yeah, we'll see. But yeah,
definitely 4.
Yeah, it's not good. Listen, we just have a little time here. We're going to have Anthony come on real soon, but I just wanted to cover quickly some of the top 20 Flyer prospect lists that have come out recently. Alex Appleyard and Charlie O'Connor had a list that they put out in The Athletic. And, of course, we had Dan Silver on from Phileas Flyer, and he had his own list. And he had some surprises on there for me anyway. It's that time of the year that we look at who the top guys are. Chef, I'll go back to you. It seems to be first or second has to be Frost or Farabee in most cases, I would think.
Yeah, well, to round it. I mean, what surprised me, and I'm sure it surprised Dan as well, that they're still considering Sam Marin as a prospect. But I guess until he plays like another 4 or 5 games and shows everybody he's the savior of the Flyers, that it's going to be he's going to be considered a prospect. But definitely, I think it's Frost, Farabee, and I see in their list a couple of them have Myers up there. I would think that Myers is past a prospect now, but I would throw Ratcliffe. I would throw Ratcliffe into my top 3.
Okay. And then, yeah, Myers is still considered a prospect. He only played, what do you have, 22 games last year?
Let's see.
21? 21 or 22, I think.
21.
21.
Yeah, 21.
Yeah, so he's still in that prospect category, and that's a technicality, but we'll take it. He's still a prospect. And it's always fun to have more guys on your prospect list that are good. Everybody agrees that Cam York is in the top 5, and then it's either Bobby Brink or Isaac Ratcliffe. And then you have the separation with German Rubtsov or Samuel Ursan. This is where Dan Silver really likes Igor Zamula. Look, he watches him more than I do. My impression of Zamula, based on limited observation and mainly other people's opinions, is that he's more of a third pair guy who we got to watch him a little bit more to know what he can bring. But he has that intelligence. Now he just has to grow physically. He's going to need a lot of time to grow into his body. But
well, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
I was at camp last year, and I'm taking notes. I was watching everything, and I looked at it over the board, and I was like, "Who the heck is this guy?" And I had to look him up. I'm like, Zamula? Who the heck is he? He's got a cool name, but who is Zamula?
Right.
And he actually stood out big time last year in camp, and he had a pretty good camp this year too. So undrafted tryout, right?
Yes. Yeah.
He definitely had potential, and he seemed to be everywhere that day. He was skating with a purpose, so it was good to see that. I can see him eventually being a third pair kind of guy. So yeah,
and he might, he brought more offense this year, Dan. So I don't want to go on a whole treatise about Igor Zamula, but I like the player. I'm just not quite as high as Dan is, but that's not to diminish what he is or Dan's rating, because he could be right. If we see more offense from a guy like that, all of a sudden he becomes a lot more than we're thinking right now.
Yeah, he's still young. I believe he's 19 years old. Maybe one more year in junior. So, there's plenty of time for him to grow. But, none of these defensemen are going to look really as good when you have Samuel Morin, who was the greatest of all time. So none of them will be able to match up to him. So it doesn't really matter.
But he's 15 on the list. He's
15. Well, they're simply wrong. That's it.
Yeah.
They got Farabee and Morin confused. That's what it was.
Yeah. It's funny. I don't think Charlie has Sam Morin on here at all. I might be wrong.
It doesn't look like it.
No, he's not.
No. Charlie might be onto something there, but I don't know. But anyway,
phone call.
What's that?
Gonna have to make a phone call.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you can phone call. Yeah, Vinny Boom Bots, right? But anyway, Rupsov, Wade Allison. It's health dependent. It's one of those things, and then in that range you'll see Samuel Ursan, Vorobiev, Hogberg. I'm not quite as high on him, and apparently the Flyers aren't. He's not signed. And Jay O'Brien kind of drifts down the list. Jay O'Brien, Chef is like a guy who was swimming in 5 feet of water. Then he tried 10 feet, and they sent him back to the 5-foot section.
Yeah, he kind of looked out of his element big time. I think that it was too much, too fast for him. He probably, we'll see. I mean, maybe he gets his legs back, and where did he go?
He's at Penticton of the BCHL.
BCHL. That's I was going to say the other. What's the other one on the West Coast? But yeah, I mean, he needs to get back to basics because he seemed like he was in over his head.
It's a reset. That's all. It's a reset year for him, and then he goes supposedly to BU, and hopefully that works out for him. Then it's a grab bag of names as far as the rest of the list, with Vorobiev, Tanner Lazinski, who probably is not in the future plans of the Flyers, or so it appears right now. Nick Aube-Kubel, Noah Cates, who has, I think, maybe he could be a fourth liner. And we'll find out this year what goes with that. Wyatt Kalinick, Ronnie Attard. I think Ronnie Attard should be rated a little higher.
It's still early though for him.
Well, right, he's a 20-year-old though, so I think his offensive game is such that I would actually rate him a little higher than some of the other guys. But again, at this point, when you're down on a list of 18, 19, like guys like Yinning, Mason Millman for Dan Silver, and then then you have others that put Mark Freeman down there. So I would check out Phillies Flyer for Dan Silver's list, The Athletic for Alex Appleyard and Charlie O'Connor's list, and some really good articles, a good 3-part section. Then they had an honorable mention, which I thought also was very helpful, because this time of year, when they start training camp, we were talking about it last show, we're going to be looking at the third line opening and see who can grab that. A lot of people are just talking about Frost and Farabee. I happen to think an older player who missed time last year, but he at least had some pro exposure, has the right profile of a player who could make it, and that's German Rupsov. I actually think he's a better shot, although I think all three of those players, Dan, could probably benefit from AHL time, nonetheless.
Of course, you're going to have everybody yelling Farabee, Farabee, Farabee because of the game yesterday? Was it yesterday?
Yeah. Nice move.
But he did I'll give him this, he made a hell of a move but to score that first goal. But, it might be a little bit too young.
Yeah, we were talking about the World Junior Summer Showcase. Just real quick, the Flyers have Farabee, Bobby Brink, Cam York, and for the United States, and Adam Yinning for Sweden, and that'll be on the NHL Network starting this Wednesday, I believe. Also, they play again on Friday over the weekend. So check the local listings. It's just essentially preparation to make a good impression for the World Junior Championships in December. So, and with that, we're going to hook up with Anthony Mingioni if we can. Anthony.
Yes.
Yes, Anthony from Mingioni. He is a senior writer for Center Ice Philly Magazine and 1/3 of the Off the Post podcast and a contributor in a couple other podcasts. Welcome to the O&B Puckcast.
Hi, how you guys doing?
Okay. So you were on with me, Isaiah, Chef, and Dan, the Flyer fan. This episode is called The State of the Flyers. We might as well start there and get your assessment of what the team is now versus the end of last season. Specifically, what do you like? What do you have doubts about? And what are your projections for them as things stand right now?
Well, where they're basically structured, the biggest issue I think that the Flyers had really last season, as much as people wanted to point to a lack of snipers or a lack of scoring, my view on them has been that they needed to cut down substantially their goals against, and that was going to require much more strength defensively. And I don't just mean from their defensive core, from just their defensive, but also from their forwards as well. I think they needed to have much better center depth than they had last season. Certainly someone who would be more of a consistent scorer. They counted a lot on Nolan Patrick to make a step forward in his second year. Didn't quite happen to the level, or at least the consistent levels that they wanted to, which obviously precipitated their first big move of the offseason for Kevin Hayes. Now, we could have a lot of debate, obviously, about, the contract itself, the fact that Hayes, had his first real, decent, really good scoring season last year, where he eclipsed the 20-goal mark and eclipsed the 50-point mark. But that being said, based on other players that were potentially available that were going to help them in the area of not just scoring, but also cutting down on their goals against, Hayes, I think, was probably the best option for them if they were looking in that circumstance. I think they also obviously wanted to allow Nolan Patrick to have some more favorable matchups. And with Hayes, at least in here at the beginning, this allows Patrick to kind of get those potential matchups. Now, of course, it'll be important for them to be able to figure out wingers that they're going to obviously put next to him in this circumstance. As of right now, obviously, if you look at the Flyers depth chart, you would figure either one of James Van Riemsdyk or Oscar Lindblom will be to the left of him. Right. The question, of course, is going to be potentially who's going to be on the right, and that's something that they obviously have to determine. Continuing on that front, certainly they did pay, in terms of cap space, a premium to bring in, obviously, those two veteran defensemen to kind of augment the development and in many ways try to move the development along for some of their younger defensemen that they feel like that was going to help them kind of move things along and accelerate the process of them getting back to contendership. Certainly the acquisition of Matt Niskanen, obviously with him still having 2 years left, I believe at $5.75 million. That deal there obviously caused some people to be taken aback a bit. Plus, he had a modified no trade clause. But we do have to keep in mind the fact that Niskanen is only about only 2 seasons removed, but more of a season removed from being a major productive player for a Stanley Cup champion, eating over 25 minutes a game during the Stanley Cup playoffs for the Washington Capitals. So Niskanen in this case is a guy I think that you look at in some ways. Is that he still has the potential for an offensive game. And I think if you're going to pair him with, say, a defenseman like Ivan Provorov, once they determine Provorov's contract, then I think the two of them together can be an effective pairing, because I think Niskanen can do a better job in terms of helping Provorov maintain gap control and to focus a little bit more on his offensive game as well as his defensive game. That's something I think that, when they had him paired with Shane Gostisbehere, while there's certainly you saw some really high-level play out of them for a stretch, Provorov ends up usually having to be the guy who has to play more of the defensive role because Ghost is obviously going to be going deep on a lot of plays. Right. In this circumstance, I think Niskanen brings a certain intelligence to a man. Most players on the Washington Capitals will tell you, he's the one guy on their defense. I think also from a intangible standpoint, which I know sometimes, we have to try to figure these things out in terms of the team dynamics. But I think Niskanen, even with the premium cost at almost $6 million for the next 2 years, if the team's going to be moving forward to become a contender, he's a guy that, to a man, most of the Washington Capitals said would be a guy that they'd go into a foxhole with and believe that, that they're going to come out successful in that circumstance. Now, we could potentially debate a little bit more about Justin Braun. In some ways, I think, and my hold on Braun has been that when they moved Radko Gudas out, they looked at their blue line and saw that they lost a key element there in terms of a tougher, more of a hard-nosed defenseman who has some experience and prior, in terms of some level of offensive production another season ago when he was playing with San Jose. Now, obviously, he had a bit of a dip of a season. He's got 1 year left on his contract at $3.8 million. But if you pair him with, let's say, a Travis Sanheim in this circumstance, I can certainly see he's another guy who, again, to a man, when I was speaking to some of the writers at the NHL draft, some of the San Jose writers, to a man, they said that Braun, while his play dipped last year, has been a very reliable part of their blue line. So basically, Philadelphia did pay what we would say is a premium cost, and there is some potential, obvious, for they are taking a bit. It is a buy low scenario here, in that not from the salary standpoint, but from the acquisition standpoint,
right?
As they move along, that these two veteran defensemen are going to help augment the two most valuable parts of their blue line. I think in both Sanheim and in Provorov. And Shane Goss's potentially, depending on what happens, obviously, with Ghost. So from an overall perspective, Philadelphia certainly paid a premium. They still, obviously, at this point right now, have about a little under $13.5 million in cap space, with, obviously, the contracts of Ivan Provorov to still deal with, and, of course, Travis Konechny. So that's the big thing now, that we're going to probably be in a holding pattern to see what's going to be happening with those players. So beyond that, obviously the goaltending situation, they made the decision obviously to bring back Brian Elliott to back up Carter Hart this season at $2 million, certainly at what was more of a backup salary in the circumstance. Again, the biggest thing with Elliott is he's perfectly slotted in terms of that particular role. The key is his health. Can he remain healthy enough in this role? And conversely, is Carter Hart going, in his second year at age 20? He's going, obviously very, we don't normally see goaltenders this young taking on such a prominent role, and you have to be, careful with regards to Hart. As good as he looked last season, when now the crown, now he's wearing the crown. How does he handle that in year two? Now, again, to his credit, I think Carter is extremely mature for his age. Every time I've had a chance to speak with him, I find him remarkable in how calm, and you feel like you're talking to someone who is approaching age 30 and not age 20, who's had obvious experiences in this case. So the hope is obviously for Philly is that Hart is advanced maturity in this case. We'll see him through in this circumstance. Beyond that, again, there's some high-ticket items here. Philadelphia, obviously, by adding more players in this case, they have obviously a lot of money tied up in 4 players between Giroux, Voracek, Hayes, and Van Riemsdyk. JVR is obviously going to be very interesting to see, if we know what he is at this point of his career, but $7 million is going to be a lot of money to be paying over the next 4 years, I think.
Yeah.
For a potential specialist in this circumstance, that's something we are going to have to keep an eye on. They have to count their lucky stars, obviously, that they have Sean Couturier at such a good at such an amazing contract, going through his age 29 season. The Scott Lawton signing certainly was a little higher than I think Philadelphia, maybe they would have liked. But again, when some certain comparables came up, I think he offers certain value to Philadelphia in a bottom 6 role. Be that if he's playing third line wing or potentially 4th line center. And again, beyond that, you got Tyler Pitlick, again, that was a case of, obviously budget, them considering what the budget situation was between him and Ryan Hartman. We'll see how Pitlick looks, obviously, but I think Pitlick is a guy who could potentially be an easily replaceable player at only $1 million a season. A Phantom could potentially be someone who could replace him if he doesn't show out pretty quickly in his this year.
Right. Yeah, well, gee, it's a lot to unpack there. Just a couple things to comment. It looks like with the defensemen that Braun and Niskanen were definitely hard minute guys. They didn't want one-dimensional players. They want to improve their PK. And the only problem I have with the Elliott signing per se is this 30 to 50 game ratio that Fletcher kept repeating in several interviews. He's ready for a situation where historically these 20, 21-year-old goaltenders who have a good first season maybe take a step back. And we were just saying before you got on, if Elliott is there and he has to play those 50 games instead of Carter Hart, then the Flyers are kind of, SOL. and that's why we're really, I think Chuck Fletcher hasn't been exactly thrifty in his acquisitions, and he kind of boxed himself into a corner a little bit.
I would agree with you. And again, this is his first year, certainly as the Flyers GM, and you're trying to also, in this circumstance, kind of getting a foothold to make it a place, I think, especially in the future, if they're going to be looking to acquire other players, that they know that what Philadelphia's direction is, and they are intending on competing as soon as, much sooner than they would, than potentially they would have under Ron Hextall in this case. Now, again, they're also taking into account as well, they do have a couple of goaltenders in system that have some experience, obviously. The Jean-Francois Berube signing in this circumstance, right. He's 28 years old and veteran. So they have, and again, Alex Lyon, the biggest thing that I keep in mind with Lyon was I really looked at how his injury, which took him out for basically 4 weeks at the beginning of last year, really kind of undercut him and an opportunity in here. And I think they're kind of sort of hedging their bets, I think, with Lyon in this case, that if there is an injury, he would be obviously, I think, the first call up in this circumstance in the event that happens. Now, again, I completely understand and share your sentiment in regards to having concern in that circumstance. You hope, obviously, in this case, that Lyon can, it was the injury that kind of held him back a bit last year and recovery from that. And just, he had as we recall the previous season before that, he had a pretty decent rhythm going before he went back down to the Phantoms, and then had a tremendous playoff, and that kind of got undercut. And then when he had his injury during the preseason, that undercut that. So, but I definitely completely get how you feel in regards to having some concern that if Elliott has to handle a larger load, it's a little bit more of a bit of a dice roll here in regards to him being able to handle that load. Now, again, he did handle quite a bit of a load, but again, it was in more of a starter role in this circumstance. So the expectations were different a few years ago a couple years back when he had his initial injury,
right?
With Philly. In this case, the expectation would be a little bit different. Would not be having to be in that constant rhythm over and over again. Again, this is the role that Brian Elliott has been used to throughout his career, being in this sort of 1-to-1A role in this circumstance. But again, 34 years of age and injury history is something you do have to take into account.
Yeah, I think we got spoiled by having Nick Foles in town, right?
A bit of that. You can certainly say that.
Yeah. Dan?
Yeah, how much organizational pressure is there to win now? And do you think that matches with what Chuck Fletcher did this summer, and really how that matches up with the rest of the Metropolitan Division thus far?
I would say there's definitely a movement within the organization here that they've kind of tread water for a while, obviously under Ron Hextall, and that moving towards Fletcher in this case was done with the understanding that they were going to move themselves in the direction of contending and getting and being in the thick of the Metropolitan Division race. Now, can you debate about the type of players that they've acquired in the circumstance? You can. But I do think as I said at the beginning, if the marching order was we do want to improve our team defense. Most importantly, our 5-on-5 play was terrible obviously terrible last season. that's something that needed to happen. And I think having a strong spine, down the middle, having Couturier, having Hayes, having, Patrick continuing to learn in a more sheltered role, that gives them a chance, I think, to compete a lot more in the Metropolitan Division. So I do think, yes, most these moves were definitely designed to accelerate this team in terms of what they're going to be coming up this season. The expectations is that they have to turn the corner. They need to win. They need to get in. They need to get into the playoffs. And not only from the player acquisition standpoint, you don't bring in someone like Alain Vigneault with his reputation of having the ability to turn a team around in fairly quick order and getting them contending. Then in this circumstance, and you bring in high name, big, fairly well-known names, 2 former head coaches as your assistant coaches. The expectation is this isn't a developmental year. This is a year where the team is going to push the envelope to be in the postseason and not just be in it for one round.
Right. Yeah, you know what? I look at it, Anthony, and it's almost like they looked at what the Islanders did last year, reducing their goal total against by over 100, and said, like you were saying earlier, you improve that second line center role from not only an offensive standpoint, but defensively as well, with the hard minutes that Hayes can take with the PK, tough opposition. You get the defenseman who can kill penalties. And it's almost like that's the model, what they're going with. Because they didn't have the splashy signings. They didn't go out and get PK Subban or trade for Kadri, which I think would have excited the fan base a heck of a lot more.
I think I completely agree with that. Certainly from the standpoint of Kadri in this case. The one thing, again, you do have to say that Fletcher was consistent with regards to he wanted to add to his roster without subtracting too much. And again, you do have to keep in mind in terms of some of the acquisitions that were made, there were players that were now again in the Subban circumstance. I think Shiro made a perfect strike in that case, knowing full well that Nashville has to figure things out. They obviously decided on Matt Duchene. They have Roman Yossi to consider in the future. So you have to kind of project that out also from Philadelphia's perspective and potentially what might come in the future, not just this year, but in years to come. And in this circumstance, I think, again, penalty kill has been a big problem for them. We all know that for several years now. It's one of the biggest knocks, obviously, on Ian LaPerriere. And I think certainly that move in terms of moving him to more of the eye in the sky role and having one of the better, obviously Gio in this case, handling the PK, I think is going to be the right call in this circumstance. So, yeah, there's something to be said for that. I think having a strong voice in the room. Trotz walked in there on the Long Island, fresh off a Stanley Cup. Everybody knows his teams have been competitive and in the mix, and it's a great thing. Now, from the Devils' perspective, again, you also have to keep in mind of you have to sell. You're fighting, in that New York market for headlines. In this case, the Rangers obviously splashed out big for Panarin and had a pretty good offseason. I think in some ways the Rangers offseason may have been a little overstated in this case because I still see some weaknesses down the middle for them. The Devils certainly made some splashy moves. Certainly, obviously at the draft between Hughes being drafted. But you're also, again, Hughes, as talented as he is, it's going to probably take at least a few months here for him to get his feet wet for them. And they're probably going to have to use Travis Zajac a little bit more. But, yeah, I think there's something to be said that there is a little bit of that Islander idea. But, again, remember, the Islanders also were not going into last season thinking that they were going to be immediately competitive either, that it was going to be a building the culture year. Most of the acquisitions were all about building the culture. And you could say the same thing potentially from Philadelphia's perspective, too. These are all guys that are, all the acquisitions that Philadelphia's made are all come with real good reputations. Niskanen, as we mentioned earlier, Braun, and Hayes is obviously from his first year has matured, has the trust of Vigneault, which I think is extremely important here. You got to have that sort of Vigneault whisperer, I think, in the locker room who knows, okay, when Elaine's looking for this is what you need to do. So in some ways, Hayes is going to will be helpful in that regard for the rest of the lineup.
Yeah, he's going to help with the buy-in. Hayes is on board, and Hayes is his guy, so to speak, like you're saying. And and of course you always have the hammer and Michel Therrien, right?
You do, and the fact that Therrien ended up, he has the reputation to be a defensive coach, so everybody initially thought, well, I guess they're bringing Neo in as the forward to handle the forwards, and Michel's going to handle the defensive, which was going to be a fascinating thing to watch initially if that would have ended up playing out that way, to watch Shane Gostisbehere and Alain Vigneault interact with one another in that circumstance. Yeah. Both strong personalities. But no, Vigneault's actually handling the forwards because I think Philadelphia looks at it from the point of view of defense, again, is not just about your blue line personnel. It's about your forwards coming back. The guy, I think, in many ways that I'm going to be fascinated to watch get some tough loving from Therrien is going to be Travis Konechny. Yeah. For as much as great as good an offensive forward as Travis can be, if you watch him closely, there are a lot of times when he blows a lot of defensive assignments and he causes a lot of stress to the defense. And that's pretty much where Travis is going to have to, once he gets his contract figured out, he is going to have to shore up the other side of the ice, because he's not at the point of his career right now where he's producing at such a prodigious rate offensively that you could just look away from the defensive gaffes that he does make. He has to shore that up, and in many ways, it is a chance it could make him it'll make him an even better forward, because if he's more responsible defensively, then he's going to have the opportunity maybe to pile up more offensive numbers by taking advantage of other teams' mistakes.
Absolutely. I could see if he could really get that together, one day he could be on a penalty kill. I could see that. He's got the speed. He's got the hockey sense. If he just a little more attention to detail and stick on puck from the PK perspective, I think the potential could be there,
I would agree. And again, Konechny has more than a little bit, I always say, he has more than a little bit of Brad Marchand in his game. Now, will he be able to top out offensively in his career as Marchand has? That's to be determined. But that's something that's worth cultivating here going forward.
Yeah. I've been looking at everything, and this just kind of came to mind. I was thinking about the projections. Every year you get like the how much the teams have improved and all. It seems like very few of the pundits feel like the Flyers have improved beyond the 90, 92, 93 point plateau, and that wouldn't net them a playoff spot if that were based on the last couple of years' standings.
That is correct. And I would agree with that. And again, it's not the acquisition. Some of it, again, comes from, I think, certainly criticism of the Hayes contract, I think. And again, that's kind of looking at things from I think, a little bit more of a surface perspective.
Right.
When it comes to Hayes, they probably, again, and I think some of that also as well, and my colleague Bill Meltzer certainly said, I remember his initial reaction. We both had the discussion about the fact that Braun has the look of a defenseman that you pick up like at the trade deadline and not getting him at the beginning of the season. But again, I look at it from the point of view of, again, from Philadelphia. Metro is obviously an extremely competitive division. Did the Flyers make sexy moves this offseason? The answer is no, they didn't. That being said, they have younger players that are on the come in this lineup that I think have the ability to be contributors coming into this year and really make a step forward. They're basically betting on in-house here, and they're betting on their younger players taking a step forward with the augmentation of, again, these veteran players being brought in, and a guy like Patrick taking the next step in a sheltered role. And Konechny getting better in both ends of the ice, not just offensively. And obviously, Sanheim, in many ways, is a big key for Philadelphia in that he's got just tremendous gifts offensively, defensively, his range. And then obviously Ivan, I think, with his advanced IQ. But again, they're not, as we stated, the positions that are, they're not the PK Subban acquisition. It's not Artemi Panarin. It's not, what Carolina has done in terms of tweaking their lineup. That being said, we have to see how things play out as the season goes on. I think there's something to be said in many ways for, not upsetting the apple cart too much, fixing things, moving things along, I think, in terms of adding and augmenting without subtracting from your lineup or taking away from your lineup as well. The biggest thing the Philadelphia had this offseason, their biggest weapon they had was cap space. And depending on how you look at it from the perspective of how much they used, again, this was something that, but again, this was how they chose to spend their money. And as of right now, I'm fairly comfortable with what they did. I'd like to see what they're going to do with their third line right wing role in this case, how they're going to basically help out Nolan Patrick offensively. I think Lindblom can help out offensively, but he's still coming along and more of a two-way player. But I do need to see who they're going to potentially put next to Nolan, because that third line can't just be just a traditional checking role. They do need to have offensive push so that other teams will have difficulty matching up with Philadelphia's other lines.
Yeah, no question. Yeah, it just comes to mind that if Nolan Patrick breaks out like Mike Richards did, like in 2008, that's a game changer right there.
Absolutely. You add offensive numbers in that circumstance, especially if he's playing in and from that third line role, or even if he moves himself up the ladder, you can very easily see. The other thing that we didn't take a look at, obviously, with Hayes is obviously he has prior experience playing on the wing. You can easily swing it potentially onto the wing, probably more likely to the right side than the left. I'd have to double check where he was positioned when he was with the Rangers. But you have that ability to kind of move him over and then not feel like and feel like defensively you'll have a strong enough second line. And then if you got to drop down to James Van Riemsdyk down a line and move things around a little bit, you could there's potential for you to do that going forward. So, yeah, Patrick's development, I think this is a big year for Nolan because, again, he had spurts of production, but for the most part last year was not the step forward that they were hoping for. And I think they're hoping here in year 3, going into his 3rd full season now, and knowing full well that, you're looking up, if he's trying to be a top line, a top 6 center, he's got 2 guys in front of him in Couturier, Hayes, and in emergency circumstances, obviously Claude Giroux. He's got as many as 3 guys that he has to climb in order to get into that role potentially. He's not a winger. He's not going to be able to swing, obviously, out to a wing. Right. So he's got to do what he needs to do this season in order to be able to push things.
Right. Dan?
If we shift the focus down to the AHL, the Phantoms are poised to roll out a lineup full of high-profile prospects this year. It should be really fun to watch. What should fans expect, and do any of these players have a shot at seeing NHL ice time this season?
I would certainly say, at the moment, I would say Morgan Frost, I think, is one of the first players I would look at in terms of likely having the opportunity to gain NHL ice time. I'd like to see a little more out of Misha Vorobiev again. I think this is a big year for him going into his final year. He's had his moments, but same boat where he's kind of a player that tantalizes you with his ability, but he's not always as engaged as he should be. And that goes all the way back, honestly. I've reports on that go all the way back to Russia. So in his days playing in Russia. So that's the thing that certainly we need to see out of him. A strong camp out of German Rupstov could also potentially push the envelope, because I think Rupstov, I think, is a really good two-way player. Yeah. He's had prior experience playing both on the wing and at center. The Flyers, and as many NHL teams, do value versatility. I know there's some excitement, obviously, with regards to Isaac Radcliffe and Joel Farabee. Farabee, I'm going to need to see a little bit here in camp when we get to training camp to gauge his candidacy for a role, for this potentially a third line role. But my feeling is that I think Farabee, at this point, even with the tournament that he's had, obviously, in the World Junior Showcase, I think you still have to kind of be careful with that. I think there's still some physical growth that has to happen. Isaac Radcliffe certainly is a guy that's tantalizing, but I think there is some skating that still needs to be worked on, at least at NHL, at the professional level. So the guys I would probably target the most at this point, if I'm looking at least going into camp from a Phantoms perspective, from a likely Phantoms perspective, who could push for a Flyers job, it's probably between Rupstov, Frost, Vorobiev if he has a strong camp, there's some other potential guys there in this circumstance. Defensively, again, I think Philadelphia, the Phantoms at this point right now, I think for the most part, Philadelphia, with 8 defensemen currently in play right now, the one defenseman I would say that probably could slot up is Friedman. If he has a strong year down there, I think he saw some time, later last season. But I think also at the same time they brought up Nate they acquired Nate Prosser and signed him for the purposes of, if there's injuries, that he would probably be the first guy to come up. So overall, I think it's more from the forward perspective than the defense perspective for the players that I would say, if you're a Flyers fan, you're looking to see potentially come up. Maybe say Pascal Laberge, and you probably need to see a little bit more out of Laberge as well. Tworinsky potentially could knock on the door, but those are the guys I would probably put on my list right now.
Gotcha. I know Connor Bunneman is somebody Brent Flair seems to like. That maybe a fourth line role if he continues along the track that he's been going so far with the Phantoms. But speaking of Joel Farabee, him, Bobby Brink, Cam York, Adam Yinning, I think I got them all. They're all going to be at this World Junior Summer Showcase. What can fans take from watching that this week? Anything?
I think for the most part, you just want to see how they're coming along, obviously, as the summer. You kind of go with, if you were paying attention to how they performed at the developmental camp, it was a good thing this year that that for the first time in almost half a decade, that there was an actual full scrimmage. Now, granted, it wasn't a full contact situation, but you still got to see what you got a chance to see what those guys could do on full ice. And again, there were certainly some good things that we saw there. Frost, you saw, how far along he's developed if you hadn't seen him play with the Sioux. Again, Farabee, certainly, I think there's definitely a feeling with Farabee that he wants to really sort of develop his goal scoring. He's known as a playmaker. In this showcase, I believe he had 2 goals in the 7-1 in Team USA Blues 7-1 rout of Team Finland on yesterday.
Right. Yeah.
So he had a particularly good tournament so far. Cam York. Again, the biggest thing you saw, we all saw it again during the developmental camp. York's got really good instincts, really good at turning around the play from his own end and getting the puck up ice quickly and getting himself in position to be a weapon. In my mind, I think there's little question that Cam York, in a few years, has the ability to potentially, in a few years down the line, to be an NHL power play quarterback. Brink, again, impressed me. Obviously, I noticed, still, he's definitely has to work at it, some of his skating in this case. We certainly saw most of what I heard in terms of his reports is his initial burst is good, but then there's certain things about his stride that slow him down going to the neutral zone. We saw that a bit in the Flyers in the developmental scrimmage. But he's also a guy who is going to engage, very feisty. We saw a lot of that where he had his nose in. He can aggravate other teams, but still have really good offensive instincts. Knows where to have his stick in position. Certainly, the pass he got from I know the goal that he scored in the scrimmage was a phenomenal pass.
Oh yeah,
Frost.
Yeah.
But Brink is smart enough to know to have himself in position to know that if you're with a highly skilled forward, that there's a chance you're going to be able to put that in. So he knows how to position himself, and he's going to get, I think, a nice amount of goals as a pro just from that attribute alone.
Yeah, Brink has that quality. He looks like like Jay O'Brien. We all know his story and situation, but Jay O'Brien showed like a kind of dogged determination, and Bobby Brink has some of that, but he brings more skill than Jay O'Brien.
I would say the thing is, again, with O'Brien, I really kind of want to hold the horses on O'Brien in terms of how he really obviously has to do well this year in the big. I think that he has to really dominate, or else that pick is not going to look good. Certainly from Philadelphia's perspective, I think there's things about O'Brien I do like, but I do think the circumstance in Providence. I don't think helped. But the injuries certainly last year didn't help. But it's just it was frustrating all around for him. Brink again, coming in, and we're going to see obviously what he's going to be capable of doing going into the season as he's going to be heading to Denver in what is I think a pretty good situation certainly with the Pioneers. It's going to be interesting. Again, I think he comes more from a goal scorer's perspective though.
Absolutely,
Brink, than O'Brien does. O'Brien's kind of an all around player, whereas Brink is a definite winger in this case. O'Brien's a center, but he could swing out a little bit. Brink knows what he is, and that is what he has to work on as he comes forward.
Absolutely. Dan?
With the relative lack of movement this summer due to restricted free agency concerns and some of the flat cap projections over the next year or two, have we reached a point in the NHL that needs to consider a franchise player exception or maybe a luxury tax system opposed to a hard cap ceiling?
It's going to be interesting to see when we get to the next CBA what is going to potentially be offered. Again, the more we see sort of a gap between, especially with the high-end players getting the contracts that they're getting. We just saw today, obviously, with Andrei Vasilevsky getting a $9.5 million contract with Tampa Bay, that it's going to end up turning into, much like in the NBA, where you have a small group of highly, highly salaried guys, and then there's going to be, not a lot of guys making a lot of money in this circumstance. So we're going to have to see, again, the NHL. We've already seen in some ways, because of the way this cap situation has been set up, that trades have occurred from a purely financial perspective and not necessarily from a getting the roster better perspective in most circumstances, or more of an addition by subtraction type of move. So, Dan, I would say that it's something that I think is going to be worth exploring once we get to the negotiations for the next collective bargaining agreement.
Yeah. Last one from me, Anthony. Thinking about the organization as a whole, what will you remember most about Paul Holmgren? I don't know if you were around when he was a player or executive, and what do you think will be the effect of him taking a lesser role in the organization, kind of like Bobby Clark is doing?
Well, I think in this circumstance, again, with Paul, he's been at it for a long time. And Paul, I've had, the privilege. I remember when I started my writing career, Paul was the assistant general manager. So he was constantly I started covering with the Philadelphia Phantoms. And Paul was, he obviously cuts, when you don't know him, he sort of cuts in a intimidating look because, obviously from his playing days. But Paul has a great dry sense of humor. In many ways, his sense of humor in many ways reminds me a lot. And I said this to my colleague again, Bill Meltzer again, is that he's not that far removed from his Swedish forebears in that, he's got that sort of dry sense of humor, funny as heck. And you got to be kind of with it when he hits you with his humor. But I think Paul, again, was very much I always felt he was a scout at heart. He loved to be out scouting players. Even as president, he was still sometimes out and about with regards to scout, kind of keeping an eye on players. And that I think was something he always, even before he became fully a general manager, he kind of had that in him almost all the time. And I think he always had good communication with his scouts because he was one himself. So I think they felt fairly confident. I always got the feeling that when Chuck was hired, that they wanted to obviously get through the year, to have him, give him the opportunity, give Chuck Fletcher the opportunity to sort of get the lay of the land, to see what he had, and then to kind of install things the way he sort of wanted to. And that's pretty much what basically occurred here. And the fact that Brett Flair, I think, is also a key here because he wasn't about to upset the apple cart. They know they've got good scouts on this. They, the junior scouts and pro scouts as well. So I think that natural transition in this case was that the boat wasn't going to get rocked too much in terms of building what they had been building pretty much for the last 5 years in terms of having probably the strongest pipeline, I think, of prospects in the National Hockey League. And a lot of other publications will obviously bear that out as well. Yeah. So I think from that perspective, I think it's the one thing you kind of sort of lose a little bit with Paul is sort of, the little bit of the linkage and the tradition of the team. There is a certain feeling, I think, organizationally that the team is in the process of sort of moving sort of more and more into the 21st century in terms of how they're sort of structuring and modeling their team, and knowing in a cap era how critically important having a pipeline is. So I think from that perspective, the transition of going from Holmgren to Fletcher, I think for the most part, I think has been a solid one. It's been as much a case of figuring out the transition going from Hextall to Fletcher in terms of what the expectations are. It's a little bit more, I think, of the Flyers of the past in terms of saying that, okay, enough of the completely just going development, and not making any moves. I think they're more likely, obviously, to make moves, but they have to be obviously smart in how they do it. And that's the biggest thing that I think we have to sort of take away of this.
Sure. Yeah, and that was one thing I was most impressed with Chuck Fletcher, getting back to him. The efficiency and how they ran the draft was very professional, the way they moved up to get Brink after moving down and getting Cam York. I thought that everything was very, very smooth, very efficient.
I thought so too. It was the movement that was done. We knew going into the draft, with obviously 2 third-round picks. I thought there was always that potential for them to potentially package to move up to get into the second, but it was a smart tactical move in this case that they knew the guy that they wanted was going to be available there now at 4, when they moved back. And Arizona obviously very much desired Victor Soderstrom, and there's a very good chance that Soderstrom will be an NHL defenseman this year. I think there's a pretty decent chance of that they were willing to make the move that they did, and that allowed Philadelphia to add that extra pick and then be able to slot and move up to get the player that they needed. They addressed, I think, organizationally, and especially with the Brink pick, the one thing that I think most of us kind of came out of that of knowing in Philadelphia's organization was who's the guy you look at who could be the potential goal scorer, the guy that you look at and say, okay, this is your goal scoring prospect. Brink is that guy.
Right.
And certainly then, but again, and Russ Cohen and I obviously have had many conversations about this from Sportsology about, passing up on Cole Caulfield twice. We'll see as time goes on whether or not that, will bear out. But I will always, you can look at Philadelphia's system and say, obviously, defensively, they needed a defenseman, I think, like Cam York, who, especially with so many of the young defensemen now already up with the team already. And if you're looking at the Phantoms right now, it's they're, other than a lot, there's sort of a gap there right now between the high end prospects. You needed to replenish that part of the system there, and I think again they were smart moves at the draft, very efficient. Actually, was pretty impressed by the I like the Sergio selection, and the Brodzinski selection was a bit of a surprise for a lot of people because they didn't expect Brodzinski to be that far down in the 7th round. So we'll see how he comes out as we go into this year. But I thought it was a very smooth and efficient draft, and I think that while I think the gears were already put in motion for the transition going from Holmgren to Fletcher having full reign, I think the draft was the cherry on top to say, okay, this puts everything in where we need to be. Now we can transition officially.
Right. Yeah, we had Russell on a couple shows ago, so yeah, he made his case for Caulfield, but we'll see how that would be very interesting. Looking forward if Montreal is lighting up the scoreboard with Cole Caulfield against the Flyers, but it's a tough call. It really is.
It is. I mean, you have to make those decisions, and again, sometimes in certain. So I think again, it comes back to a lot of people after Alex DeBrincat went 36th and has done what he's done with Chicago. Nobody wants to sort of be caught with their pants down again. Now, Philadelphia did make, I think, a little bit of a risky call, but other teams did as well. Most of us thought, I think most people thought Caulfield, with the amount of hype going, that there was a possibility of top 10 for him. I think Caulfield went in the range that I kind of thought he was going to be, anywhere between 7 and 15. He ended up, obviously we obviously ended up at 15. I think it's a great pick for Montreal because again, he was the type of player that they didn't necessarily have in system either. So I think both Philadelphia, from the perspective of drafting York and Brink, in that circumstance, address the two needs that were probably most important that they needed to have in their system.
Exactly, and without reaching, still getting in that value range where you don't, you're not pulling. My memory is failing me, but I'm thinking of some picks in the past where it looked like more of a need picking that high up in the draft. You don't want to do that.
No, and that's the danger of it in this circumstance. And for everybody again who keeps pointing back to DeBrincat, remember 35 other teams passed. 30. It was I should say 35 other teams. There were 35 opportunities to draft him, and
right.
He was taken, and people passed on him. So there's the general mindset of unless it's a slam dunk top of the generational level scorer, you have to take in the top 2 or top 3. That there's a little bit more play involved in terms of where your goal scorers will potentially come from. And the second round, I think, was a good spot for Philadelphia to take Brink. There's some work obviously has to be done with the skating, but I think a lot of everything else, I think a lot of the other things about Brink is good. And if they work out the skating element of things, they got a real good. I think the Flyers have a pretty good young player on their hands.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Anthony, it's just been a pleasure having you on. What can I say? Where can people find you on Twitter and at Center Ice Philly Magazine and an Off the Post podcast? So
you can find certainly on Twitter. I'm at where my name is obviously at Anthony Mingioni, ANTHONY MINGIONI. One thing, no underscores there. Center Ice Philly Magazine, which will, certainly in terms of will hopefully be ready to go. Printed issues certainly when the season hopefully gets started for this season upcoming. Already kind of cultivating and getting things together for those for the first issue, which you can find on stands at just about every local hockey rink in the Delaware Valley area, going as far out as Allentown and Reading and other places as well. At Off the Post Radio, we just completed I believe this is our 6th season, our 3rd with a 3-man group with me, Russ, and Mike Augello from Hockey Buzz, who's the reporter. He covers the Maple Leafs and also covers the Sabres for Buffalo Radio as well. We'll probably be back together again we've done obviously stuff on the Hockey Buzzcast together, right. But in terms of the regularly scheduled podcast, we'll be back probably in September with Off the Post Radio for our 7th season.
Fantastic. Anthony, thanks again for coming on, and hopefully we can do this again.
Sounds good. Thanks, Isaiah. Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Take care.
Yep.
Well, Chef, I think you should have a period here where you can have your say about what you heard.
Well, I liked what he said about the defensemen, because we might have overpaid a little bit, but did we overpay to the point where their presence and who they are as leaders and teachers in the locker room for this young defense guys that are we have brought up over the years leads me to believe that I kind of was leaning towards that way to begin with, that I didn't mind so much the signings than whether they were overpaid or not. I was looking for more skilled veterans to show these younger guys how to be more consistent. So that I took that away from that. I agreed with that, and I really appreciated that.
Great. Dan, any comments or things that you want to comment on?
Yeah, I think he's echoed a lot of the stuff that we've been saying for the summer thus far, and it gets me excited for the season, just around the corner now.
Yeah. And just another reminder that if you want to see some hockey, I think it'll be on the NHL Network, the World Junior Summer Showcase, where Farabee, Brink, York, and Adam Yinning, who unfortunately seems to be trailing the play a lot for Sweden, you can watch these potential Flyers this week, hopefully. So
I think tomorrow at 4:00, isn't it?
I don't have the time. I have to be honest. I don't want to give wrong information. Yeah. But check your listings if you get a sports package that has the NHL Network. And gents, with that, just one last thing before we call it a wrap. I mentioned when Anthony was on that the pundits are kind of unimpressed with what the Flyers have done, and most have picked them to not make the playoffs based on the point projection. At one pundit, who is one of my favorite commentators, is on the SiriusXM NHL network, James Boomer Gordon. He was giving GM grades out, and he gave the Flyers an F.
Wow.
And it was mainly because of how they handled the press conference when they fired Hextall. And I don't think he knew about like the entire situation. He thought that was a clown show in a manner of speaking. And in a way, yeah, I think it was. But I think Ron Hextall calling up Tyrell Goulbourne for like the second or third time after getting waxed in a game where they quit on national TV, Hockey Night in Canada versus Toronto. And it's something had to change. And, it was a bumpy ride, Dan, but I think in the end, the Flyers made the right move.
Yeah, that time from November to January, and they fired Hextall and later Dave Hakstol, and we all remember how that, went down. It was a very rough time. It was a very weird time. I think the writing was on the wall going into the season after a couple games in October when things didn't, work out the way that everybody thought they would, that somebody had to go, something had to give. And it was only a matter of time. And when it did, it felt very out of the blue in a sense. It very much felt like Paul Holmgren woke up one day and said, "I don't want Ron Hextall around anymore." And it was a bit of a crap show in terms of what was going on there. But I think it was the best move for the organization as a whole. It was time to move on from Hextall and Hakstol, and could have been handled better, absolutely. But did they do the right thing? Yes. Has, Gordon, Fletcher, what's his name? Lane Vigneault, they've handled the transition very well since then. So I think the initial happenings there were not very good. But overall, I think they've handled very well, and the F was not very well deserved.
No, I don't think so. I think that'll the best way to combat that kind of attitude is just go out on the ice and prove it, and then it'll be a different situation. So, gents, I think we have come to the end of another show where during the summer it's really tough with content, and yet there's a lot to talk about. There's some other things we could have gone through. Dan, where can people find you on Twitter and on your various websites?
Well, you can find me at Dan the Flyer Fan. You can find my sites at Brotherly Puck, at National Puck, at Brotherly_pod, and at NationalPodNet. Check out BrotherlyPuck.com. The weekly summer series are happening right now. Top 5 every Monday. How They Became a Flyer every Tuesday, which is the Trade Lineage series. History of Flyers jersey numbers on Wednesday. And then Friday is the Abbreviated History of series, which are biographies of all your favorite Flyers.
Fantastic. Chef, you are at the Steam Pub. What can you tell the people?
I'll probably be there for every day in the next 2 weeks here. It's that summer blues. Everybody's going on vacation, so I will be spending the next foreseeable future every day there, hanging out morning to night and sitting there going, boy, I'm still underachieving. I'm still not doing as much as Dan the Fly Era fan. But you could be coming, you say hi, ask for me. I'll come out, talk to you, buy you dessert. How about that?
That's fantastic. Well, where is Steam Pub?
606 2nd Street Pike, Southampton, PA, Bucks County.
Okay, and on Twitter, you're at Chef to the Left D.
Yep, that's it. You can find me there, and you can catch me at a Chef at Steam Pub on Instagram as well.
Ah, fantastic. Yeah, well, of course, I'm Isaiah, and you can find my individual account at Isaiah, ISAIAH _ don't forget that, 520, at Isaiah _ 520, and of course we're at O&B Puck, the O&B Puckcast. If you could subscribe to our show on one of the many platforms we are on, iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher, so many. We have iTunes, O&B Puckcast YouTube channel. it really does help move the show up the charts. It helps get us more notice. And as we monetize and do stuff like that, it really allows us to keep the show free and all that other good stuff. We appreciate that. And we'll probably hit you back with another show sometime in August, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3. Maybe the Flyers will pull a surprise here as some of these teams sign RFAs, and we'll have to see how that works out. Until then, everybody, take care.